So, I guess it's evening to you, morning to me, but welcome to the NDF AGM, what we refer to as a fireside chat, but I have no fire, but
I
probably
have
have quite a lot of
candles. I have
chat.
candles in front of me, so
Okay, that'll
there's
do.
fire in the room.
And we've been talking a little bit for a while, Ash, but what would be really helpful is I have your bio, but nobody wants to hear me read it out. But it was really good listening to you just briefly talk about your experience. So, by way of introduction, can you just give us an idea about what you've been doing so far in the digital realm and world?
Yeah, certainly. So I think I'm probably the archetypal generalist. I'm a sort of self-taught coder back in the day. I My undergrad was in music technology. I've always been a tinkerer with digital things and technological things. Um, I've held various roles in the cultural and non-profit sectors in-house. I went through a period of always being the first digital manager in a few organizations, which was an
Right.
interesting experience, sort of helping people to define what that even meant. I then ran Subtract for 9 years, which is they're a digital agency based out of the UK, but working with cultural organizations around the world, normally on web projects. And then last year, I went freelance and I'm now a consultant that works with organizations on things that normally involve some combination of a strategic challenge or opportunity, um, institutional capacity, technology, and audiences. And those
Exactly.
exist at different levels of volume in each of the different scenarios I find myself in. And I sort of run a podcast, I do a newsletter. I find this stuff interesting and have sort of been doing versions of it for the last over 20 years now.
Perfectly placed to talk to our AGM audience today. And I've had a bit of email exchange, but we've got a discussion today that looks at imagination, resilience, and I love this phrase, letting go. So by way of kind of kicking off that conversation, should we talk a little bit up front about why this topic and why now? And particularly for glam, because as we were just saying, a few of us are experiencing, the somewhat backflow of chaos, still out of COVID, and also in a world that is somewhat changing at a rapid pace, and the ability to be able to cope with that. So, yeah, um, interested to hear your thoughts around that from your position in the world.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe I'd start with why imagination and then I'll go to the sort of moment that we're in because
Yeah,
it feels like we talk about imagination a lot in
yeah.
our sector, creative vision, ambition, innovation, but imagination on its own isn't going to change anything. And I think what matters as much but doesn't get as much airtime is the sort of the scaffolding, the conditions that helps imagination move from aspiration to actually having a tangible impact on our organizations and our visitors and our audiences. Um, so I'm interested in maybe talking a bit about imagination, but also talking about the sort of systems that imagination exists within in our sector, and maybe what we might be able to do to allow more imagination to happen, but that imagination to be able to be nurtured and sort of turned into impact. Um, and I think the moment that we're in, as you've just said, everyone I speak to at the moment is describing this pattern of sort of acceleration of
Mm,
challenge. It seems like there are more challenges that are more strongly felt across a greater array of how they exist, um, accompanying that there is sort of quite significant levels of like fatigue bordering on burnout,
mm,
on a like sector-wide level, I think, and there also seems to be this widening gap between not even ambition, but sort of expectations and the realistic capacity that organizations have to deploy. And so I'm sort of interested in how imagination maps onto that as a possible, not solution, but tool that we might be able to use to try and work out what we do. What are we going to do to try and dig ourselves out of this situation that we find ourselves in?
I guess the other thing is, change never goes away. Change is actually more of a constant than we all think. And even having that capability and thinking about the way that we can best deploy imagination is something that will always happen. But I think the other point that you'd put in one of your emails to me, which I thought was great, is this actually is about potentially enjoyment and a bit of hope. So without being too rosy or positive, we do have some degree of privilege in the work that we do. And the way to bring our audiences with us and our organisations a longer path to something that's a little more positive and joyful.
Absolutely.
Which I really liked. So yeah, should we dig into it a little bit more and think about, you talked about what are those conditions and thinking about what we are needing to consider at this moment in time with all those challenges that we have in front of us.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe interesting to start with thinking like, what's the nature of the challenges that we're facing? And there's this distinction that I think is quite helpful from a thinker called Ronald Heifetz, and he makes a distinction between what he describes as technical problems, and they are clear, relatively easy to solve with existing expertise, whether that exists within your organization or not, and what he calls adaptive problems. And adaptive problems are messier, harder to define, don't have one clear solution, and they're normally cultural in some sense. And I think that maybe one of the reasons that everything feels so hard at the moment is almost every challenge we are facing is adaptive in nature, and a response requires a change in habits, being able to take people with you, clarity, shared understanding. It's not just about skills or better tools. And I think that maybe digital practitioners are more comfortable with this because most digital work sort of mixes, it's a heady mix of technical and adaptive problems that non-digital practitioners maybe perceive as technical problems. But I think that the danger that exists in our current moment is a misdiagnosis of the challenges that we're facing as problems with a technical solution, rather than actually these are adaptive challenges. We can't probably just buy some new tools or hire a couple of new roles or reorganize our teams and expect them to be resolved. And I guess just extending this idea a little further, there was a philosopher called Karl Popper, excellent name. And he wrote an essay in 1965 where he defined challenges as either clocks or clouds. And you can fix a clock by taking it apart and tightening its bolts, but you can't fix a cloud in the same way. And so I think it's another version of that diagnosis, I suppose. And I think we need to try and recognize that what we're dealing with is a sort of a context that requires quite messy solutions that are going to be powered by people and collaboration and culture. And they will probably be quite slow to fix. And in the past, I've talked about this idea of like slow change and fast change. And cultural organizations are generally quite good at fast change. That is sort of like, doing a rebrand, getting a new website, but they may be less good at sustaining the slow change, around behaviors, alignment, because of the quite reactive nature of a lot of the organizations that we work within. And I think, coming back to our sort of umbrella topic, that's where imagination actually becomes really useful, not just as like having new ideas or blue sky thinking, but actually as a way to explore these adaptive challenges, test assumptions, start to experiment with what better conditions might look like. Because I think the challenges that we're facing sort of require a combination of patience, learning, collaboration, and imagination, supported by structure, which we can maybe talk a little bit more about in a moment.
So it's sort of like a ways of working. One of the areas that you were highlighting was the work through ACME of the digital mentoring, and there were a couple of phrases that really kind of stuck out to me. This whole thing around increasing a greater tolerance and receptiveness to experimentation, feeling comfortable with ambiguity, knowing that things are going to be unpredictable, and then using imagination as, I think these were your words actually, in terms of being curious. And with that curiosity, you start to feel a little bit more secure. And then with that security, you start thinking about that as a way as being able to feel in a positive position to be able to tackle things. Now, this sounds all quite theoretical, I guess, at the moment. So knowing that our audiences are working in real time, what are your thoughts around how this then transfers into the working environment with, with some really interesting application of that digital mindset and imagination?
Yes, I mean, you referenced the ACME and Australia Council CEO mentoring program that's happened twice now. There's a really good evaluation report that I would encourage people to skim. Maybe it's quite a long document, but I think yes, that report identified that this trait of digital imagination was really important, but it also identified that that trait was only effective and valuable and impactful where there were specific organizational conditions.
Yeah.
And those were things like time to think and learn, access to, and I think this is important, sector aware experts. So it wasn't just an expert in a particular digital thing, but someone who understood the specific constraints and priorities of cultural organizations. They also identified that it was really important to be able to access exchange with peers who were tackling similar problems, and also that there needed to be enough organizational stability for experimentation to feel safe. And those four things might all feel slightly luxurious to people listening to this, but they are also sort of deeply tangible things that can be created. I.e., it's possible to create those four things within most organizations. How possible it is at the moment for individual organizations to do that is going to be wildly different depending on organization's context. But certainly the ACME research identified this. I'm currently involved in the leadership development program, working with cultural leaders in the UK, and very similar things are emerging, that when the cohort on that program have been able to start to create some of these conditions within their organizations, actually the beneficial effect of that is felt almost immediately. So whilst it might feel slightly luxurious and slightly can we afford to do this, there is, I think, a growing body of evidence to show that when organizations can carve out the time, can start to create this sense of safety around experimentation, and can start to connect into a wider network of both support and exchange with peers, that can start to hold a space for really productive experimentation.
You'd made this comment to me that was really interesting. Like, it really stuck out to me. And I thought, wow, I want to ask you more about this. The work that you're doing at the moment in the UK, you'd said the sector's difficulties with doing less saying no, being clear and aligned about what the priorities are is also a brake on progress and impact for many. And I thought that's really fascinating because as a middle management person or someone who's going to be working in senior leadership, we have an expectation to be able to do good governance, efficient management, deliver on time. We have all these very sort of traditional tools that we use, and very much around managing risk and making sure that we are responsible with public funding. But this kind of, tension with the break on progress or the impact for many is that they would like to do more and take risk, but then we have this tension. Can you talk a bit more about that? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, certainly. And I think maybe this is a relevant moment to mention a research report, easy for me to say, that I published earlier this year, which looked into failure in digital projects. Because I think a lot of these ideas were present in that analysis as well. So I heard from almost 50 cultural organisations who shared stories of digital projects of all kinds that had failed, and we looked at the reasons why those projects had failed. And there were some really clear things that came out of that. I mean, perhaps most importantly to reiterate is that most digital project failure was not because of anything to do with technology or technical reasons. So the findings sort of were that projects are rushed, goals are vague, leadership support is inconsistent, teams are really stretched, and lessons go unlearned. There was sort of this, people described that we either launched the thing and then immediately moved on to something else, or the thing failed and we immediately moved on to something else. There isn't this sort of embedded practice of reflection and then capturing what those lessons actually are so that they are useful again in the future. And so I think that there may be 6 shifts that it would be good for cultural organisations to consider. I think the first and perhaps most important one is to make it safe to fail, and that's not to say you're encouraging failure, but that you're acknowledging failure is part of learning. It's not a source of shame. And maybe a reframe there is, rather than saying it's safe to fail, you're aiming for it's safe to learn. Because if you never fail, you're never going to really learn any lessons.
Safe to experiment, isn't it?
Exactly. And sort of making that habitual across an organization, across every level, and that leaders are really modeling that curiosity is welcomed, normalizing that, encouraging that. This next one is really super obvious, but I think almost every story of failure that I received had a version of this not present, and that was be really clear about your goals and what success looks like before you start the project. Why are we doing this? And so often I'm brought into projects halfway through where that question is very differently understood across the mix of people that are working on a project.
I think that's a really key thing. Sorry to interrupt. It's across the group of people for sure.
Yeah. And I think that in that, what I'm not describing is I'm not saying drive for consensus, because you will probably never achieve consensus. But what I am saying is you need to drive for clarity and agreement on what the goals actually are, even if not everyone is saying, and I think this is the right thing. You want them to say, I don't think that's the right thing, but I do agree that's what we're doing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I think there's a thing here that the next one is maybe difficult, within a sort of constrained funding environment. I know lots of organizations having to make difficult cuts, but we heard, and this is a version of a challenge again I hear a lot of, projects as funded until the go live day, and then not beyond at all. And actually, with almost every example I can think of, you need to have some level of sustained resource beyond that initial launch point, because otherwise you're setting it up for failure from the start. And that maybe means you need to constrain your ambition and with what the thing is that you're launching, so that you're actually protecting resources to maintain and evolve that beyond the go live point. The next one is around sort of building reflection into the rhythm of your work. And that's, that can be as sort of prosaic and everyday as like regular check-ins, asking questions like, what is working? Let's capture that. And what isn't working? Let's capture that and sort of unpick that. When you start to habitualize that type of conversation as well, you get better at surfacing issues earlier, which in turn reduces the cost, effort, complexity of fixing them. Certainly also, in my observations, those types of questions lead to better conversations, which leads to better work. So sort of building that reflective practice into the rhythm of the organization. And lastly, and you hear calls for this in every conference you've ever been to, but fostering collaborative, but I think this next word is important, empowered teams. I work a lot with leaders, and a lot of leaders express to me that they get very frustrated that everything seems to get escalated. Every type of problem immediately gets pushed up to the highest point in the organization for a decision to be made. And that is symptomatic of disempowered teams not sure about what they're allowed to make decisions about. And so I think fixing that is good for your teams, because you're giving them agency, you're giving them power, you're giving them more control over the work they're doing. But it's also a good thing for leaders to do, because you are clearing a load of stuff off your plate. Not as much stuff is going to get pushed up onto your desk if you're fostering more empowered teams. And there was a really nice couple of quotes I just want to sort of read verbatim. So one person said, "The real failure is pretending everything went fine when it didn't." And so I think sort of remembering that. And the next one is, someone said, not everything needs to be a huge success, but we do need to learn something from it. And I think the idea of learning is really, really important, because so often I see organizations stuck in this cycle of making the same mistakes every 3 to 5 years because people leave, stuff gets forgotten. And that's really inefficient. And when we don't have as much resources as we would like, that is sort of a really dangerous way of wasting time and money.
I think that's really, a lot of this chimes bells, I'm sure, with many people listening to this as well as myself, but this empowerment of staff and trusting expertise, because you have the right ingredients collaboratively across your team, and so trusting them with some of the decision making and being able to contribute, and also just being really clear about what your level of responsibility is as a leader, so they don't feel the weight of everything on their shoulders. They are free to go and imagine, like you said, do some of that thinking. There was something else that you'd noted as well, which I thought was really great, was also taking responsibility about experimentation across all levels of the organisation. Because it's good to empower your staff. At the same time, you need to recognise, as with that last quote illustrated, that if you're asking people to experiment, you're also asking them, or giving them permission to fail and learn for the organisation, and taking that responsibility around that. Have you paused again?
No, I'm here, and I think, as with imagination, I'm not just saying have loads of ideas. With experimentation, I'm not saying just throw a load of stuff haphazardly at the wall and hope some of it sticks. We don't have the luxury of being able to do that. Everyone has more work to do than they have time to do it, and ambitions that outstrip the budgets available. But I think, if we return back to our description of the current moment, we are facing, and I'm going to use that word, an unprecedented set of challenges that are either novel in nature, the culture sector hasn't had to deal with them before, or they are larger in scale than the culture sector has had to deal with in recent memory. And so the sort of tried and tested tools and approaches that have got us to where we are today are probably not going to be appropriate for dealing with that completely novel set of challenges. And so therefore, experimentation becomes essential in trying to work out how we move forward, how we actually take our organizations sustainably forward from here. And again, that can't be something that is only held at an operational level or only held in executive conversations. It needs to be a practice that it sort of threads through the mindset and frames lots of what institutions do in sort of every corner. And I think, again, this word experimentation is, like so many words. Digital, what does that mean? Experimentation, what does that mean? I think it's about being quite specific and potentially quite small scale initially with the ideas that you're testing, but being really clear about why you're carrying out an experiment. Is there a new opportunity that you've seen? Is there a different solution to a challenge that you're experiencing? Being clear about what the experiment involves, how long it's going to run for, and how you'll know whether or not it's successful. Because certainly the organizations that I sometimes work with, this fear of experimentation seems to come from fear of the unknown. It's like, oh, it will be a distraction. We don't really know what it'll involve. We don't really know how we'll know whether or not it's working. And actually, if you can have quite specific and clear conversations about that, it doesn't need to be some giant months-long pieces of work that's a complete black box. You can be experimenting, as I said, at all levels of.
One of the things I've always got on the side of my mind is the practical reality and I really like that idea of smaller experimentation and being nimble. To put that through. But one of the readings that you sent through, which we were talking about before we pressed record on this chat, was the Ed Rodley post, which is about this sort of idea about antifragility and the right ingredients that you have in an organisation to be able to respond to the challenges across all echelons. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I quite like that idea about the balance that was talked about at the end with the barbell.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, Ed's post is great. If it's out there, I think on his newsletter. And he's talking about this book from Nassim Taleb, which is called Antifragile. And in that, there is this idea that Nassim calls the via negativa, which is defined as the route to resilience through subtraction rather than addition. And Ed, I think, quite correctly diagnosed that the museum sector is quite good at additive solutions. More stuff, we'll have a new platform, we'll start a new program of activity, we'll hire a new role, whatever it might be. We're not so good at subtractive solutions. So stopping doing something, saying no, we're not going to pursue that funding opportunity. We're not going to worry about this particular challenge at the moment. And it's also worth saying that humans as a whole, there's been some research around this. I'm a human. Our natural response to problem solving is to add more stuff. It's not natural for us to solve a problem by taking away. But in Antifragile, Nassim Taleb describes this really effective practice of subtraction. And actually, if you think about it, potentially every no that you say, every subtraction that you make is going to create a little pocket of oxygen, whether that's like time or money or attention. And in those pockets of oxygen, that's where experimentation, imagination, and learning can happen. But it's difficult. I absolutely recognize that it's difficult because subtraction is pretty laughable maybe to think about when you're already running super lean, you're running on the bare minimum. Lots of teams aren't making a choice between addition or subtraction. They're sort of in survival mode. And also we have a lot of funding models that reward newness and they reward this sense of more, but they don't really reward either maintenance or a stopping of activity. But the whole focus of Antifragile, from what I can tell through Ed's article, is about resilience. And, busyness is not resilient. Busyness is super fragile. And so I think we maybe need to have some really tough and really honest conversations about doing less, knowing when to stop something, knowing when we can simplify something, or being really clear about what the core things are that we're protecting and what is maybe more elective. And I think even for organizations that are in that sort of crisis survival mode, in those modes when every other resource that your organization has available is rescinding, imagination sort of becomes potentially the only thing that you can have agency over. So I think imagination is still valuable even in those really constrained and difficult contexts.
Coming to the end of our conversation, I know that a lot of us really find examples in real life really helpful. And knowing that you work with so many organisations of different scale, it would be great, and even outside the sector, even if you want to give us a couple of examples of some of the things where you think would be useful case studies or things that people could go and have a look at.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm going to maybe pick two recent examples, places that I've visited this year, one from Finland and one from Switzerland. Because I'm in Europe, so let's go full European. So I was in Zurich a couple of weeks ago. I went to the Museum for Gestaltung, which is the design museum in Zurich. And they had, part of the building was dedicated to an exhibition that they called Museum of the Future. And in that exhibition, they had programmed 17 digital experiments to explore how their collections could reach people differently. So this was everything from some AI stuff through to the world's biggest digital image. It's like 3 terapixels. It was enormous. Through to a bunch of motion tracking play experiments that used Swiss puppets from a contemporary puppet designer from 1918 as the sort of creative catalyst. And then there were all these experiments from these postgraduate students using a variety of digital tools and techniques. And what I liked about it is that it was presented as part of the museum's main program. It was given significant real estate within the building. It wasn't sort of in an annex that you had to walk through another gallery to get to, and one small, slightly sad set of headphones that where the right ear cup didn't work, and you weren't quite sure what you were looking at. It was a diverse and interesting set of experiments that were from museum practitioners, digital artists, students. They had brought together quite a diverse cohort of different collaborators that supported and helped curate the exhibition. And so I think that was a good example of genuine experimentation existing at the heart of a museum's practice rather than sort of innovation theatre. And so I think that was interesting, and there's stuff on their website that you can check out. And I think that was maybe interesting to me because it was polished. It was a nicely designed exhibition that it didn't feel ramshackle going around, but it was clearly experimental in nature, and some of these experiments were much more successful than others. And I think that was quite a usefully brave decision that they made, A, framing it so clearly as a set of experiments, and B, sort of learning in public, and allowing that plurality and diversity of perspectives and voices to have fed into what their exhibition looked and felt like. So I think that was a nice example of the experimentation stuff done credibly. And then maybe if we go back to this idea of imagination and this idea of conditions, and this idea that imagination doesn't need to be just something that exists at the top of an organization in strategy conversations. So the main library in Helsinki is called Oodi, recently reopened in a beautiful Zaha Hadid designed building, really stunning building. But I think what's really interesting is that the focus and the nature and the design of the library, what it actually does, how it operates, the services that it offers, was co-designed with the input of 3,000 citizens of Helsinki. And I think, again, that was a really genuine, I think, expression of co-design. But that didn't only come about because they had a new building. They have a long, sort of 2-decade long practice of genuine sort of openness and engagement with the public. And so, again, this wasn't performative in nature. This was a genuine exercise in collective imagination. And there's a really good article which I'll reshare. I've shared it a couple of times, where one of the librarians says, this isn't a library that librarians would ever have imagined. This only exists because we asked the people of Helsinki to help us imagine what a library for them needed to look like, feel like, function like. And then they created structures through which that imagination could be articulated, and that sort of ownership could be delegated and distributed. And so I think it's a really nice example that actually collective imagination between an institution and 3,000 perspectives from the public doesn't need to be chaotic, but it does need designing, and it does need scaffolding, and it does need designing over a realistic sort of time horizon. And you're seeing some other versions of this sort of reimagining in the UK. The National Gallery recently, Birmingham Museums Trust absolutely did this sort of what they call it, Citizens Assembly, and the National Gallery. Borrowed, but to take an inspiration from that idea as well. And so I think it's interesting to see an organisation like the National Gallery, which is 200 years old, conservative with a small c in nature, big, slow, is opening itself up to that nature of external reimagining. I mean, how much impact that program will have, let's see. But I think it's interesting that we see more examples of this. And I think, again, it's an example in Helsinki at Oodi, where imagination isn't just about enthusiasm and having loads of ideas. Actually, in order for it to feed through into anything meaningful or tangible, you have to have those structures, and it has to be focused, and it has to be engaged with intentionally. So that's just to say, I don't think it's useful for organizations just to say we're being more imaginative, we invite imagination from our audiences. It sort of needs to have a purpose.
Yeah, that goes back to that whole preconditions. I mean, I think, you should come to New Zealand, you should come to Aotearoa, Ash, because there's some really interesting practice here that's been going on for many years, especially in line with Te Tiriti practice and considerations of inviting people and ensuring that people who need to be at the table are at the table. So, you could almost track an evolution in museums for this practice and see how it's evolved over time, and how that is a really useful and responsive, healthy way to ensure that you remain relevant as well as fit and able in the society that you're servicing. So yeah, I feel like you need to come here and we could talk more about the cultural context in which we work. It'd be really interesting to compare that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Ash, I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of NDF for, making time for us today. It was really appreciated. So many good links and thoughts that you had. And what we will do, we will make sure that those links are available. We'll post them up somewhere so that our members can access them, and, follow up and listen to your work on your podcast, and also go to your website. I know I recently listened to one about the choreographer Brandon Powers and his intersection of his work with VR. So I thought that was really fascinating. So yeah, it would be great. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thanks for the invitation.
Right, thank you.